A few years ago, I found myself in the doctor's office. You know that time of the year, the vaccine season? I gave the doctor my arm. Okay, well, more like he took it from me while I protested violently. My parents never got over the fact that I sounded like a dying pig, but that is besides the point. I was sitting in the front seat of the car while my older brother was in the back, and I, being the curious girl that I was, decided to ask, "So what was this shot for?" And that's when my mom hit me with the answer I did not want to hear. "Well, sweetie, when you're older and you begin to have intercourse," no, not while my brother was in the car. "We'll have this talk later." I knew what this meant. The classic birds and the bees. My mom was going to give me the talk. Are you getting that feeling yet? You know, the "I don't want to be here, please get me out of here" feeling? Well, don't worry, I won't be giving you the talk. My issue is that when we avoid these uncomfortable conversations, we unknowingly inflict a bigger problem on ourselves and others around us. Which is when I began to realize that this is representative of a much larger issue. Communication is a core part of the human experience, and yet we still struggle with it. Our levels of communication in our day-to-day lives are facing some serious challenges, and they're starting to take a toll. So today, let's take a look at why and how we communicate. Then, look into fostering a society of clear communication by identifying and analyzing the self-inflicted and environmental barriers currently plaguing our society today. So the communications process begins with the sender, the person sending the message. They create an argument or an idea or feel a feeling, which is the content. Then, this content is encrypted through a means, a channel, whether it be speech, a letter, body language, or even physical appearance. Then, they encode the message, and it's received by the receiver through one of their 5 senses: sight, touch, sound, smell, or taste. See, when the receiver receives the message, they interpret it and send back feedback, consciously or unconsciously. Thus, the communication cycle is a cycle. But notice how many opportunities these disturbances or noises have in between these steps to inhibit the passing of the original message. So why is this important? Well, for starters, Salesforce software company reports that companies that communicate effectively are 50% more likely to have lower turnover rates. In the workforce, we are seeing our lack of communication leading to anything from missed deadlines to low productivity rates. In fact, in our educational experience, we're seeing a roadblock. In politics, polarization, and all over the world, deaths due to misinformation or lack of information. So let's talk about these buzzing disturbances. George N. Gordon, professor of communications from Fordham University, explains that communication serves 5 major purposes: to inform, to express feelings, to imagine, to influence, and hold on, my personal favorite, to meet social expectations. It's this 5th purpose that tends to kick in when we find ourselves in social settings, causing us to hold back. Psychology today takes us into one of the many possible effects of this gut feeling, and what can simply be described as the bystander effect, occurring when the presence of others discourages an individual from intervening in an emergency situation. See, we are avoiding some of the most pressing issues in our society out of the notion that they aren't socially acceptable. We're seeing avoidance of topics like female hygiene, politics, money, sexuality, mental illness out of fear of what other people might think. This comes as a direct result of valuing your self-worth based on people's perceptions of you, and what psychologists call meta-perceptions. We ignore some of the most pressing issues in our society out of the notion that they aren't socially acceptable. But the thing is, these definitions vary person to person. So who decides what's good enough? Well, if at one point we give in to all of these regulations and individual definitions, at one point, there won't be a single thing left to talk about, which leads us to what our first problem is. We simply aren't talking about some of the most important things in our society. We've taken the idiom, ignorance is bliss, far too literally in our day-to-day lives. If we remain in a society who praises the ignorance of our citizens, our democratic government will have very little purpose. As seen in a 2010 Atlantic study, Americans are far more likely to identify Michael Jackson as the composer of a number of songs than they are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution as the Bill of Rights. We need to be having these conversations because our democracy thrives off of the active and informed participation of our citizens. So, whether or not these discussions may raise some controversy, we have to be having them. And in fact, according to my AP Gov textbook, controversy educates us. But the issue is, we're beginning to fear it. We're hiding from these conversations, the ones that we need to be having the most. Which leads us to the vulnerability. When we don't have conversations, it does not make us immune to it, but rather more vulnerable. According to a recent FEMA study, last year, only 39% of Americans have developed emergency plans for weather disasters, leading to an approximate 10,000 weather-related deaths in the US alone. When I was in 4th grade, I asked in front of my whole class, "So what's the difference between tobacco and Tabasco?" Everyone laughed at me. I laugh at myself for asking that question. But I'm glad that I did. Because if I hadn't, that night, I might have been at the dinner table asking my mom, "The food's bland. Can you pass me the tobacco?" See, even in the high school classes that I'm enrolled in, we're seeing a lack of participation in the classroom. When the Tenney School in Houston, Texas asks its students, "What are the reasons behind you refraining asking questions in class?" They responded with 2 answers that resonated with me. First, fear of appearing dumb, and second, fear of their peers. See, we can't be ignoring things, especially not in our growth and education. It's not just in our work and our relationships that we are seeing our lack of communication taking a toll. It's also appearing in our early days of development. So, leading us to our perhaps hardest barrier to overcome, bias. Sharim Hashmat explains from the University of Illinois, an associate professor. He tells us that when we would like a certain idea to be true, we often end up believing it to be true. Essentially, we look at news sources that promote our understanding of a certain topic and neglect the idea that there could potentially be anything that could disprove this understanding. And the important thing to look at is going back to our communication loop. Every message that we send and receive is put through our own lens of bias. And oftentimes, our most detrimental biases are the ones that we struggle to identify. Now, we've come a long way with technology, from algorithms designed to spot fake news to language translation apps, breaking the most obvious barrier of speech. But we really need to take a look at us and learn to communicate effectively for our educational, developmental, workplace, democratic, and personal benefit. We need to take a look and remind ourselves that not talking about something does not make us immune to it like a vaccine does to a disease. Thank you.